I want to talk about another ethical theory. It's called utilitarian ethics. Um, there are actually two major features of utilitarianism. One is what we call the consequentialist principle, and the other one is what we call utility principle. Consequentialist principle simply states something like this: an action is right if it has favorable consequences, and an action is wrong if it has unfavorable consequences. Um, now, um, so that means for utilitarian, then, or at least due to the consequentialist principle, an action is not inherently right or it's not inherently wrong. It becomes right or it becomes wrong depending on whether it has favorable or unfavorable consequences. Now, so if you ask a utilitarian, is lying wrong? So I'm assuming that a utilitarian might reply and say that it depends. You know, it depends on the consequence. Now, at least basically, I think that that's what the consequentialist principle means. Okay. Now, the other major feature of utilitarianism is what we call utility principle. So it simply means something like this. Um, for utilitarians, there's only one thing that is unconditionally good. For some of them, they will call it pleasure, and for others, they will call it happiness. Okay, so let me say it again. The utility principle simply states something like this: there's one thing that is unconditionally good, and for utilitarians, it is pleasure or happiness. Okay. Now, so let me say something about Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is actually he's known to be the father of utilitarianism. He's a British philosopher. Um, um, now, one thing, or at least one of the most popular quote from Bentham is, when he said something like this: "Morality and law were made for humans, not humans for morality and law." Right? So he said, morality and law were made for humans, not humans for morality and law. Now, so what does it mean by that? Um, Bentham's trying to say something like this. Okay. Um, we created morality and law in order to serve our purposes as humans. So that means we're not here to serve morality and law, but we're here to um, be served by morality and law. Okay. Now, so usually when we think of morality or law as something that we need to submit ourselves to. But as a matter of fact, for Bentham, um, a moral rule or a law is considered to be valid um, relative to how it actually meets our needs or our purposes as humans. Now, so for Bentham, there's only one thing that is good, and he refers to it as pleasure. And there's one thing that is actually evil, and he thinks that that is actually pain. So that means then the goal of utilitarianism for Bentham is uh, maximize pleasure, minimize pain, or whatever it is that maximizes pleasure or minimizes pain for a greater number of people. That is actually what is considered to be the right thing to do. Now, what is the wrong thing to do is whatever it is that actually maximizes pain and minimizes pleasure, right? That is actually the wrong thing to do. That's for Bentham. Bentham thought that goodness is something that is quantifiable. So he thought that we can actually measure goodness. What does that mean? He introduced what is actually known as a hedonistic, or it is referred to as hedonistic calculus. So it's like a way that we can calculate whether an act is good or bad. Because again, he thought that goodness is actually something that is quantifiable. Now, so what does that mean? He thought that there are, certain things that you need to consider when you're trying to determine whether something is right or wrong, and you just need to determine whether something will actually lead to something pleasurable or whether it will lead to something painful. Now, so for example, for Bentham, he seems to think something like this. Or at least there are, I think, probably about 7 conditions that you need to consider in order for you to calculate whether an act is good or bad. So, for example, one of the things you need to consider is intensity. So, for example, before you perform an act, one thing you need to ask is, how intense is the pain, and how intense is the pleasure that you will get if you perform that act. So he thinks that you can actually somehow put points for it, right? So if you think that the pleasure that you will get is much more intense than the pain, then you probably put more points on the side of pleasure rather than on the side of pain. So other things that you need to consider is duration. Now, what is duration? Duration has something to do with the question of how long will the pleasure last? How long will the pain last? So for him, these are just some of the conditions that you need to consider. So, for example, other conditions that you can consider is, I think you need to ask questions such as, if I perform this act, what is the likelihood that if this act leads to something pleasurable, that pleasure will be followed by another pleasure? Or what's the likelihood that if I perform this act, whether this pleasure will be followed by pain, or whether this will be followed, if it will be followed by pain, what's the likelihood that it will be followed by pleasure? So something might be painful in the beginning, but it might be pleasurable in the long run. Okay. Or something might be pleasurable in the beginning, but it might be painful in the long run, right? So one of the other 7 conditions that need to be considered here is the question of extent. Okay. So one thing that you need to ask is, if I perform this act, how many people will find it pleasurable and how many people will find it painful? So for Bentham, the way to calculate whether something is good or bad, or the way to quantify whether something is good or bad, is by actually considering those different conditions there. Okay, so that's actually known as hedonistic calculus. Now, actually, if you read the reading from Bentham, you will find that he actually explained what I referred to as hedonistic calculus. So Bentham thought that if you put points on the side of pleasure and points on the side of pain, one thing you can do is you can add the points, and if the points are actually, or if the sum on the side of pleasure is actually greater than the points on the side of pain, then it's more likely the case that the act will lead to something pleasurable. However, if the points on the side of pain is greater than the points on the side of pleasure, then it's more likely the case that it will lead to something painful. Now, Bentham also thought something like this. Suppose we are one whole community and we're trying to figure out whether to perform a certain act. So one thing you can do is this: each of us individually, right, will have to score, right, whether the act will be good for us or bad. Now, and then the point is that if it turns out that the act will be pleasurable to most of us, then that means that act is good. And if it turns out that it is actually painful to most of us, then that act is bad.